You have once again entered the world of the survival horror. These words still echo in my mind whenever I recall that fateful night in the Arclay mansion. It's a bold statement, not only inviting the player into the right mindset, but also declaring itself the codifier for an iconic gaming style that to this day is unlike anything else in media, as well as a multimedia franchise that continues strong still. Resident Evil and survival horror are about as synonymous as can be. It's the series that set the standard for the genre, and even when some of its games stay away from that formula, it cannot escape the shadow of comparison to the genre. So what exactly is survival horror, and what's so special about this game that codify it? Find out with me as we fight to survive the original survival horror title. I think before delving deeper, we ought to dissect what exactly is survival horror, and show how the original Resident Evil codifies the genre. The first thing Resident Evil teaches us about survival horror is this: you will have limited, obstructed, or abstracted control over your characters. In Resident Evil, this comes in the form of fixed camera angles and tank controls for your characters. These work exceptionally well in making you feel the same struggle to maneuver in an enclosed and disorienting environment that your character feels. Remember, these people are carrying loads of weapons and items in an environment they've never seen before, so these measures do a great deal in really putting you in the same mindset as these characters, as well as enhance the tense atmosphere that grows with each voyeuristic camera angle. While later games would drop the fixed camera angles and tank controls, all but one would keep to this core conceit of limited control of your character in one way or another. The second and possibly most important aspect of survival horror is meaningful inventory management. Resident Evil 1 does this in only allowing you to carry 6 of any sort of item at a time. Want to carry a gun? That's going to take up at least one slot. Want more ammo that can fit into the magazine? That's another slot. Want a healing salve in case you get hurt? Slot. Want to carry a key item that will even let you proceed to the next part of the mansion? You're going to have to sacrifice something to carry that. It creates this agonizing risk-reward system that makes even trips to safe rooms a tense and interesting bit of game design. If you go better armed, you're going to end up having to take more trips, but get too sparse with your ammo and you might end up facing a foe stronger than you anticipated without the necessary firepower to take it down. And that means going back to your last save. And going back to your last save is even scarier than it sounds in Resident Evil, as even the ability to save is a limited item that you have to manage resources of. Throughout the game, you'll be given ink ribbons that function as consumable saves that can be used at typewriters, which function at save points. This is simply brilliant. It forces you into the same headspace as your characters. You're not tense because a low-poly Minecraft zombie is coming after you. You're taking this threat seriously because you know your last save was over an hour ago, and dying means having to repeat all that effort. This way, it merges the oppressive atmosphere that the characters are feeling narratively with how the player is made to feel through the game mechanics, and it's one of the smarter uses of narrative through gameplay mechanics and developing empathy in a player that I've ever seen. Last but not least, survival horror gives us a tenuous balance between being empowered and disempowered. In Resident Evil, you're given an arsenal of weapons to use that have devastating effects, but limited ammo. In certain points of the game, you might come across a room of zombies and decide you have to pull out your shotgun and just tear through them, and man, is that cathartic. But it's only cathartic because you've been tiptoeing through the mansion, saving every scrap of ammo you could get your mitts on. The game manages to keep you constantly on the teetering edge of being overpowered and completely helpless. That's what modern titles going for scares like Outlast and Amnesia completely miss. If you're given no ability to let off some sort of steam and show skill in fighting back even a little, you lose the engagement of people looking for something more than just another haunted house ride. This near perfect balance is what elevates Resident Evil over its contemporaries in the genre, but the skill it requires might also be why titles like it fell out of style as the market pushed towards more casual consumers who did want a haunted house ride more than engaging but demanding experience. In simpler terms, without allowing for some sort of combat that plays into decision making, your interest curve is just going to turn into a flat line. But is codifying a new genre that would come to dominate the early 3D era of gaming enough to make Resident Evil stand on its own 2 feet? I mean, yes actually, but it does so much more. The game is host to a simple but entertaining thriller mystery that keeps you crawling through the mansion, rewarding you with new story beats that bolster the new items you find in your search across this lonely mansion. It's not exactly a super dense and detailed story, but it has just enough of a through line with plot points appearing just often enough to entice you forward. Usually these plot bits are accompanied by a new key or weapon. That's another example of how Resi 1 puts the player's mindset in line with the characters. Your characters feel compelled and energized to solve this mystery with each new tidbit and clue, while a player who might be less invested in the B-movie plot will still feel just as excited to continue on because of the opportunities that the new weapon offers. Though I will admit, this particular aspect is the one most marred by the, shall we say, colorful voice acting.
Don't scare me.
That's what I was going to say.
But just take a look at this. It's Forrest. Oh my God.
It's awful.
I'm going to find out what caused Forrest's death. It looks like he was killed by a crow or something.
It's hard to deny that Resi 1 has an age like fine milk with beautiful cutscenes like these. While the game design is brilliant and the plot is perfectly serviceable, the execution of that plot and cutscenes leaves something to be desired. Thankfully for those looking for more immersion, the majority of the story is actually told through non-verbal notes found throughout the environment, leaving you, the player, to piece together what exactly took place through these environmental clues. In fact, its roots in point-and-click adventures add a level of depth to the setting and layers to the gameplay that many later imitators lost sight of. Pressing the action button on almost anything of interest will give you a more vivid description of the item in question, but often you're also granted insight into your character's thoughts about that, fleshing out the world and your character at the same time. Another feature often forgotten by the very genre that this title spawned is sprawling non-linear map design. Each new item often opens up not only the next item and a set of optional items, but paths to multiple key items, allowing the player to change his or her plan on the fly and experiment with routes on repeated playthroughs. This leads to a great deal of replayability and encourages you to try again with different routes or making different decisions on the fly. Or at least it does in the starting areas. See, after the first mansion visit, which is about 1/3 of the game through, key items become a mostly linear set of events. While personally, I would have appreciated if a bit more of the game had taken place in open-ended mazes, I will admit, there's an addictive quality to these more action-packed sections. It feels like you were outmatched by the overwhelming nature of the first part, but as you come to grips with the controls and mechanics of the game, it funnels you into areas where you can test and show that new mastery. This balance between a carefully considered puzzle-heavy thinking man's game and an action-adventure shootout is what defined this particular series from the start. This dichotomy works well in earlier titles, for the most part, and especially well here. It makes you feel that, like the characters, you are starting to come to grips with the situation, and in response, the game is starting to pick up the pace to keep you from being bored. This balance would definitely not always be carried out perfectly, and even this game feels a little off-kilter if I'm being honest. I feel like if they had added one more big open-ended area between the more linear sections, it could have really helped the pacing of the game. I suppose in theory that's what the return trip to the mansion is supposed to be about, but it just doesn't quite hold up, since at that point there's really only a few rooms left to explore if you haven't already thoroughly explored the first time through. It's also worth mentioning that the increased linearity comes along with an increased focus on combat and boss encounters, which leave a little bit to be desired if I'm being honest. The bread and butter of this game is the resource management, which often leads to preparation for combat encounters being more involved than the combat itself. As a fan of RPGs, the system's right up my alley, but I will admit that if you're going to have a real-time combat system in your game, adding a little more in the way of combat complexity to complement the resource management might have been a good idea. Nitpicks aside, for a first outing in a new genre, this game is outstanding. I think its biggest flaw is simply that it's been outdone by its own legacy. Later games just have perfected what this one set up. But it's still a perfectly enjoyable little game as is. I really have to give props to an era of horror titles, not simply content with throwing violin stings and invincible monsters forcing you to run away like horror games in the HD era. Rather than settling on a one-and-done jump scare fest, the team at Capcom made a perfectly considered, extremely replayable title that was so good it spawned a new genre that all but ruled the 90s, and can still be felt in the DNA of games today. If modern gaming, especially horror, has left you feeling a little disappointed with how shallow it all is, how the mechanics are completely divorced from the actual tension of the situation, I cannot recommend this game series enough. And even this early in the series, you'll get a satisfying horror experience with lots of quality camp to boot. When you're not genuinely being scared by its gameplay and mechanical systems, you'll be laughing your butt off at the barely English lines read like this.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich. Just a moment. I found something.
What is it?
It's a weapon. It's really powerful, especially against living things.
It's me, Chris.
Is that you, Rebecca?
Jill, you're here too.
Yes, you're here too?
There are terrible demons. Ouch!
So, do you think this absolute classic still holds up today? Is there any point in playing it now that the remake exists? Why are all modern horror games except Resident Evil the worst thing ever? Now, let me know in the comments what you think about Resident Evil and the state of horror games. And while you're around, if you would hit the like button if you enjoyed the video, it'll let me know to make more videos like this. Thank you for your time. My name is Dalin Malna. God bless.